Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I am the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. Here today with my friend and colleague, Scott Massey. Scott's been with us before. Scott started his military career as a combat officer for the U.S. Army. He has 3 decades of experience in security and development, and he's worked in some of the most challenging parts of the world, including conflict zones in Nigeria, Yemen, and East Africa. Scott's operated both in business and military contexts in sub-Saharan Africa and the Gulf states and Asia. You've also worked, Scott, in software, military defense equipment, and the medical industries. You've advised senior government and military leaders as an expert on security and development issues, specifically escalation of force systems, counter-piracy, countering violent terrorism. And you've been part of advanced teams that were responsible for securing public spaces that would have been akin to the environment of Butler Farm. So we want to get into that a little bit. So we're now 5 days, Scott, after the now infamous assassination attempt on former president and now GOP nominee for president-elect Donald J. Trump. As we move along here, the story keeps getting weirder and weirder as more information comes out and more angles are exposed about what happened before, during, and even after this horrible event that took the life of at least one person that we're aware of, and two others who, to my knowledge, are still hospitalized in critical condition. So, Scott, with that, maybe we can back up and talk a little bit about what happened. And I think we should just do that free form and just let this go where it goes. There's a lot that can be talked about. There's a lot that's been shared on social media and otherwise over the last few days. But I'm curious for your perspective, given your background, your security background, your current activities, recording as we are from a non-disclosed location on your part, in the middle of some interesting stuff. You've had some time to think about it, to absorb the events of Saturday evening, July 13th, 2024. Tell me, let's maybe start with what happened, and then we can get into why do we think this happened the way it did.
Right. Well, yeah, Mike, I mean, and it's been ad nauseum, the analysis at the local security level, what went wrong, why did it go wrong, et cetera. Most of my background has been at a higher policy level, the organizational level. And I think that's what I'm not hearing as much about. I'm certainly criticisms of the Secret Service and their leadership, but there's a whole systemic failure here that I think we really need to highlight. And some go conspiratorial on it. I'm not against the conspiratorial arguments right now. There's certainly failings, and you can argue negligence or deliberate. But I think the overall issue is that, you have got a massive systemic failure. And I would say it's a failing on imagination, leadership, and just understanding what is your core function at this level. And what is really troubling to me, and I see it, and this is indicative of many events, but we've seen the political spectrum dominate all spectrums now. And I think when we start talking about what did we just witness, we just witnessed an organization that has one directive: the executive protection of president or presidential candidates. They have other missions, I get it, but they lost the script. They're into all sorts of other agendas and priorities, and I think that has really weighed heavily on my mind, because I see it again in either business turnarounds or military organizations. As the undisclosed location, by the way, is Fort Johnson, Louisiana, at the JRTC, but we're seeing that within our organizations. They lose the focus for why are we here? What are we supposed to be doing? And they take on all these other agendas. So I think that's what I'm seeing most not being discussed analysis wise from a leadership perspective. And I think that's where we're seeing the beginnings of the failings. And this is just a fruit of that outcome.
Well, let's talk about that, but first, maybe let's just hone in for the moment on what were the failings as you saw them the day of the event tactically. What happened, and then let's go back out to where I think you rightly wanted to go and talk about, which is how in the world did we get to this point? You mentioned a couple words. You said either incompetence or something intentional. Unfortunately, at this stage, 5 days later, it's hard to imagine a third option. In other words, the spectrum is somewhere between gross incompetence and negligence and something more malevolent. And park that for a second, maybe just from your perspective, what were the specific failings that you saw as you looked in the sort of the aftermath?
Yeah, so we'll diagnose this like a physician would. We'll look at the symptoms first, and the
Yeah.
symptoms, somatic errors, are uh, a short time frame upon which to do the reconnaissance of the area, uh, lack of coordination between interagency. It almost sounds like a repertoire of every other intelligence security failure we've seen in our lifetime. Which, Mike, between you and I, we've seen a lot. It's amazing the categorization of intel failures, and this is one of those. And the symptomatic portions, lack of reconnaissance, lack of a good intel plan, lack of coverage, lack of interaction between the agencies, and then on the ground, a lack of what's your ROE, your rules of engagement. Okay, when do we have permission to shoot? When, what's my escalation of force drills? All those things seem to be unclear, and not that people don't know what to do. They're just not sure when they can do them or what's authorized. I've heard everything from, well, they can't engage unless they're being engaged. I'm like, no, in protective security, no, that's your whole principal's life hangs on you're taking the first mover advantage. If you identify a threat, you take action immediately. Um, Even our rules of force now on local law enforcement, if there's a problem, you have to interdict, even if you're a lone gunman. And we see the Pennsylvania law enforcement officer that was climbed up on the roof and he's hanging there some precariously, and he fell back and it's unclear what was going on there. And he said the weapon was pointed at him, so he withdrew. I'm like, well, the drill is you engage, and if you fell off the roof, okay, find a way to re-engage. That's, as a soldier, the fight doesn't stop because something negative happens. You've got to continue the engagement. So when we're looking at this, the local failings, they're all across the board, and typically they're a lack of coordination and detail. And then we see the actual security detail that's assigned. And I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look at that group of agents with, just how they handle themselves around the limo. You're like, my gosh, my kids handle weapons better than that. I mean, they were confused. There's this, what are we doing? Where are we going? Cannot shoulder a pistol. They got their sunglasses on very appropriately. That was a good drill. They drew, but you're just seeing it was like a clown show. I mean, from any kind of a military or security perspective, you watch that and it grieves you. It's like, wait, this is not acceptable. We are the American, force. We are the most powerful force on the globe, and this is what we have protecting a former president and a presidential candidate. And it goes even larger. Robert Kennedy's not received the security support. So you just go there. They have lost the script of what is their role, what are they supposed to be doing, and why are they doing it. So we can go into more depth if you want to on the site, but we could talk for hours about the failings that were there, because they are
Just
almost.
the one glaring question, Scott, that I have about the site itself was, and it's unanswerable because there's no good answer, but how they could have left this rooftop unsecured. I mean, when my sons were younger, they really got into paintball, and one of the very first lessons that they learned were, fields of fire and angles of coverage and getting the high ground and all that sort of thing. So I would argue that a 12-year-old paintballer would have recognized that as a superior location for depth of logic, etc. So, any thoughts here on what happened?
Well, clearly they did have eyes on that roof, because within moments of a shot, they were able to execute a precision shot and took out, uh, in a much more accurate way, the shooter. So they had eyes on
Right.
that. It wasn't there was coverage. The rules of engagement, though, and they said they observed some of the photos that have gone on of you have a picture of the shooter with his back to you. That was taken by surveillance on that day. They had him observed. Now we're hearing he's been under observation for, I've heard, between 36 minutes prior up to longer. And then his view on the roof, there was, some 90 seconds of visual on him, and they were asking and calling up, and you're going, oh, okay, so you did have coverage. Then I hear, oh, we secured the building from the inside. And then there's another discussion of, well, the person who was supposed to be on the roof didn't, that crew didn't show up. Okay. I mean, in combat, that happens. Your crew can't navigate the terrain to get to the location. What was your secondary plan? How did you adjust? Did you adjust positions? But they did have coverage, because within nanoseconds, they had shots backfired, and they were precise. and you even see the shooter come off his optic, and then he's back on it, and he engages immediately. So they had coverage.
Yeah.
That was
Okay. Well, more to come on that, I'm sure. Maybe we should move on and talk about the, some of the other issues that you've raised. So there's been quite a bit of discussion around the Secret Service and their role, and you moving away from the protective teams, the people who were on the ground on site, but overall the process. You mentioned a couple of things. First of all, you mentioned RFK Jr. Has been requesting very visibly Secret Service protection for well on at least a year now. It's been denied repeatedly by the Biden administration, which seems all the more perverse in light of his family's history, his own father, his uncle being assassinated under very disturbing circumstances, and really unresolved and unclarified, at least officially and formally, as to how that happened. So maybe he has mixed feelings about having the Secret Service or any U.S. law enforcement protect him. I don't know, but it occurs to me, though, that he was in a very dangerous situation, just anecdotally. So I was at Consensus in Austin's big real world assets and crypto conference, blockchain conference back in, I think this was June. And he was being interviewed by Mario Nawfal. I was going to meet Mario, and I knew, I figured out on my own where the room was they were meeting. I essentially walked through what I could tell were a couple of layers of private security, but was never stopped or really questioned on where I was going with what I was doing. I walked right up to the door. They were recording live when I got there, so I waited outside the door for a bit. They finished, and RFK Jr. walks right out. Now, if I or someone else had been a threat, there was absolutely no buffer between he and I.
Yep.
And he did have some, recognizably private security around him, but it was definitely not in really providing any adequate protection. A day or two after the assassination attempt of former President Trump, Biden administration reverses course and says, okay, maybe we'll provide this. Number one. Number two is there have been these reports which the agency has denied that Trump had requested additional resources and was not provided them and allowed. Maybe you can comment just a little bit on, sort of the overall situation as you see it. Sorry, one of the things, Scott, just to ask about is, I'm trying to remember when it was now, but as you know, historically, the U.S. Secret Service was a part of the Department of the Treasury, and it was moved, I can't remember if that was part of the Patriot Act or sometime within the roughly last 20 years, to Department of Homeland Security. Maybe you can comment on that and whether you think that has impacted the development of some of these events.
Well, I think it only matters in the sense of who's heading those agencies, what is their focus, which is a key element of my discussion. I do want to hit something that you said there, when about the Kennedy request and the Trump request for added security. A lot of people think that's the local security presence, the body of people that are around him. But if you understand a true protective security detail and what's all involved, it's very, very elaborate because it's layered and it goes in many days ahead. The excellence, and you learn this when you work with the special operations folks or any of these. They're tough guys and gals. They're able to do extraordinarily physical things, but the biggest aspect they bring is the planning, the detail, and the layered apparatus. And they can do the heavy recon and security, that analysis, the threat analysis. They have intel people on their teams, and they're able to look in depth. That you could approach a Kennedy unaccosted that's a dramatic failure, but it also shows at so many levels of failing that he probably doesn't have a layered security plan. He has a couple of local muscle guys, and that's it. Where Trump had a layered security detail, they were asking for it to be buttressed up and beefed up. I've heard both sides that it was denied. Then I've heard Director Cheadle say, yes, we have increased the security, or we've flowed resources to. She said something very, very obscure. It wasn't clear. Did you? Because even the reporter asking her, have you actually increased your security presence or no? And she says we've flowed more resources their way. Well, I don't know what that means. Did you increase it or not? And if you did increase it, by God, that was a terrible increase, because what we saw on the ground was dreadful. Anyway, so to get to these points, the security component is multifaceted, layered, very intricate, very complicated. And it involves not just the presence right around the principal, the person you're protecting, but all the components that go into that. So you have a proper threat analysis and that you can plan an area like Butler. That was a complicated space. Every space is complicated. Buildings, water towers, woods, grass, local people, all these things. You don't address that with a couple of people around you for muscle.
Yeah. You mentioned Director Cheadle. So Kimberly Cheadle is the head of the U.S. Secret Service. She, on the one hand, in a recent interview, has said that she takes full responsibility for what happened as the director. On the other hand, she says, no, I'm not going to resign. I'm going to stick with the post. I don't get it. So do you have any explanation as to why someone in that authority, direct responsibility for that group, is refusing to step aside?
Well, why would she? There hasn't been a debacle that this administration has undertaken where anybody's been resigned or failing. And I go back to, near and dear to my heart is Afghanistan. And watching what we saw in Afghanistan was utterly despicable. And how the CENTCOM commander and the Secretary of Defense and all down the line, how they were able to retain their role is still a mystery to me. But we've seen it one event after another. And Trump even highlighted in the debate, he goes, you haven't fired anybody. And yet we, from in your world on the economic side, I don't see our finances being managed well. The Fed is doing all sorts of nonsense, and we're seeing rampant inflation, complete failure when they said it was, going to only be a little while. No one steps away from this organization. So if I'm Secretary or, Director Cheadle, I'm probably going, there's a long list of people ahead of me that probably need to resign first, and then I'll go. But there is no precedence within this administration for any level of accountability of the leadership. However, I don't think that to answer your question even more directly, they do not hold a merit-based performance plan. They hold an ideological plan. And that's most of my focus in where the failings arise. These are political operators. These people look at everything through a political spectrum. And so the outcomes of whether it's Secret Service or whether it's DOD in Afghanistan or the Fed, or does it achieve the political objective required? And that's very concerning to me, because politics is only one institution of many in our country, and it's not it's usually the trailing indicator. It's it's downstream from culture, and we're seeing that institution dominate all of the thinking and leadership style and approach and methodology. And that is very concerning, because these organizations, Secret Service, DOD, were not formed for political reasons. They were formed for security reasons. And when you leave those realms of what your charter is, you begin, it's a decadent process after that. And it just, one thing falls after another.
It's interesting. I'm just reflecting on what you just said, but if you look back on the 4 years of the Biden administration, you're right in that not only have they reinforced incompetence and allowed this sort of thing to go on, it's basically been rewarded, and the individuals who would otherwise have been held accountable, responsible for these actions, not only allowed to stay, but promoted, advanced, kept in on the train. And we're at this coming to a moment where this is all coming to a head. I think one of the things that's most disturbing to me about that and the entire political warfare that has been going on is, following the attempted assassination of a former and likely future president, we had all these calls from the Biden administration for peace, for a tempering down of the environment. Everyone repeated the line that political violence is never acceptable in a democracy. All true, except it was hard to swallow when the administration and the various mouthpieces have been spouting verbal political violence now for 4 years, meaning repeating lines like Trump is an existential threat to our democracy. Trump is Hitler. You will have seen that about a week before, New Republic, a normally left-leaning magazine anyhow, comes out with a cover page that shows Trump looking like Adolf Hitler a la 1933, and with the entire magazine devoted to, if this man is allowed to continue, that there will be basically the same thing, a National Socialist Party 2.0 in the United States of America, and basically asking the rhetorical question: if you had the opportunity to go back in time and take out Hitler, would you do it? Incredibly inflammatory language. And that is not a unique case, Scott. As you know, this is something that's gone on among a lot of our political leaders, the media, et cetera. Everything short of, and in some cases, including saying, as Biden did recently, we got a bullseye on Trump. How is this possible, Scott? And maybe just your reflection on the intellectual terrorism that has been going on for what's really almost a decade now.
Well, I think that hits right into the sweet spot of my greatest concerns here is that, again, everything's gone through this political prism. Clearly, the left perceives a Trump and MAGA type of agenda, and even Project 2025 and Agenda 47. They're a decentralizing force that dismantles a lot of executive power. We saw Chevron deference cases come in. So to a left progressive who wants a central authority, wants a central operating power, all these forces are arrayed against that. And in their mind, that has to equate to that's a great evil, because they see the great good being an expert class, a very, very educated, smart people running a very sophisticated, efficient government, and everyone benefits. And that's a very Marxian, Maoist type mentality. So, you know, I won't indict them with basically being nefarious. I will just say that is their ideology. So when you encounter a force that goes against that, well, that's an existential threat. So, and to them, that they've gotten very, very fond of using Hitler as their nemesis. And you know, the only thing I can link between a Hitlerian type government and a Trump government is there's some national pride, and I've actually had many debates over this: is nationalism evil? And you know, I, as a patriotic American, commissioned officer in the United States military, I'm a very patriotic nationalist type guy. Well, I am supported by leftists find that to be evil.
Yeah. And I think one important distinction that always should be made here is nationalism is patriotism. It's a love for one's country. You know, the distinction with National Socialism, the Nazi ideal, was it was a racially based ideology. In other words, the affinity was to the German people, this idea of the Aryan race, an racial and ethnic identity, which allowed the extremes that it went to be carried out. Very different from the kind of nationalism that says, I love my country, the place in which I was born, the only place I have to call home, frankly. And you're right, this new left has really begun to associate even that kind of basic patriotism, basic love of country, love of patria with again with a Nazi ideology. And I think it's terribly confusing, especially to younger generations who they don't understand the difference when the broad brush is applied in that way.
And we're not educating them to understand what that difference is. And I think that's extremely troubling, when we should be educating them that the difference between Stalinist Russia and Hitler Germany, nationalism was focused on the national borders. The Stalinist structure was a global communism. So the both of them were socialists. They, in their name, they're both socialists. One was just focused on a country, another was focused on a global level, but they're both socialists. So I think, you know, to answer the original question, yeah, we continue to see that ideology driving everything, and then their whole protective security policy is their threat analysis is that's what the threat is. That deregulating, decentralizing, self-governing group of people is a distinct threat to their idea of central authority run by experts, and the true, what they call the progressive model. It's, you know, been prominent in this country since the Teddy Roosevelt Wilson days.
Yeah, and speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, it struck me we have some very strange similarities between the assassination attempt of Donald J. Trump and the attempted assassination of Theodore Roosevelt when he was running for a non-consecutive but third term. And at the time, this is around 1912, if I have that right, he had already been president. Say it again.
Bull Moose Party, yeah.
The Bull Moose Party. Um, but there was a strong resentment and part of the populace because of this view that running for a third term was un-American. That wasn't the traditional way. It wasn't illegal or against the Constitution or laws, but it was just un-American, and it actually incited quite a bit of anger along similar lines that he wanted to become a permanent dictator. I don't know if the word dictator was used at the time, but that idea of that he was going to become king. And he again, just like Trump, the day of actually the Republican National Convention, an hour or two before, he walks into a saloon and the saloon keeper shoots him in the chest.
Yep.
And would later go on to say, I wasn't trying to kill citizen Theodore Roosevelt. I was trying to kill the third termer.
Yeah.
So political reasons. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's life was spared because he had his speech, 50 pages, right here over as his body armor. As it turns out, that protected him. Although it turns out he did end up getting his fragments, embedded between his ribs that had to stick there. So, but survived and went on to give his speech, just
Yep.
as Trump did that same day. So a little bit of a digression into American history and another assassination attempt for very political reasons. We have seen, I think it's now, 7 either attempts or successful assassination attempts against U.S. presidents. We've talked a little bit about John F. Kennedy and how that one is still, in my mind, if slavery was America's original sin, whatever happened on Grassy Knoll is America's original lie. And until we have a moment of truth and reconciliation around what actually happened November 22nd, 1963, I think we're still going to be living in the damage and the wake of it. I want to go in another direction. Maybe pause there. Any reaction to any of that?
Yeah, no, it's just, obviously we've got a list of these kind of things, with from Lincoln to Garfield to McKinley. Remember, Roosevelt became president because McKinley was assassinated.
Right.
Then you go on. But yeah, it's not unprecedented. We've got multiple reasons we've seen this happen, and we have an extremely sophisticated apparatus to address that now. That's what's most troubling is it's not for lack of resources, nor is it for lack of anything other than imagination that I think we're seeing these kind of problems starting to hit us. So
Yeah. Okay, so we're back. Scott Massey caught up in a thunderstorm trying to record this outside. We're here again. Going to conclude quickly here with this discussion on the attempted assassination of former President Trump, some of the aftermath. Scott, the question I was going to ask you about is we spent some time on this during this session talking about the institutional rot that appears to be infecting a lot of our federal institutions. We talked about what's going on with Secret Service. We've talked a little bit about the implications for DHS. I started to mention that the FBI has now been tasked with doing an investigation here on what has happened, which strikes me as not particularly good news, given what we know recently about, for example, the Russian collusion hoax and the role the FBI played there, the burying of the Hunter Biden laptop investigation information, January 6th, the documents raid of Mar-a-Lago, and on and on and on, including going back all the way to the complicity in the cover-up around the JFK assassination. So not clear to me that this is going to produce anything other than a perpetual investigation. I can predict the outcome now as being lone shooter. We don't have a motive. It was just something that happened. Nothing more to be learned or done about it. Your reaction, Scott?
Yeah. The FBI should be tasked with this investigation. However, the FBI has certainly not shown itself to be credible, and I think that's what is really troubling overall is that there isn't an agency right now or an institution within this federal government that we could really turn to and say, okay, I have complete trust that they will execute properly and that they will be objective about this and that they'll go about it in a way that will satisfy the curiosity. We have many open investigations now that have gone unresolved, from the Las Vegas shooter to just you already listed off a couple yourself. And I would say that is the greatest problem is that, again, we've seen a political agenda drive all of these things, and it's simply what fits the political narrative. And they always talk about narratives and things. How about the truth? How about what happened? And let's fix it and let's get this organization going. And it's not about rhetoric, it's about outcomes, and there needs to be some responsibility held. And until we see that, I think we're going to have persistent problems. I am not confident that any of this will be addressed appropriately and that will come out. I have not been confident after Afghanistan or even the debacles of multiple deployments over many years how that was handled. We've never really had a reconciliation of these things, and the political class has either buried it or used other things to get in the way of truly finding out what happened and why was it a failing and how do we deal with it. And it isn't just firing people. I mean, there's a lot more to it than firing people. That's something that sets a precedence, but we really have to get into the systemic reform that is required. We've become very big and very sloppy as a country, and we need to get back to an efficient model that works. And I think that's most driven by a decentralization. The more you centralize, the more inefficient and removed from the outcomes you get, and that's a big problem that I think we're witnessing almost daily now in various areas. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that gives me a little bit of hope is I see, if you were watching in real time over the course of Saturday and into Sunday, there was one source where you were actually getting information in real time, and that was on X, on Twitter. And the mainstream media was falling way behind. I mean, they wouldn't even admit that it was an assassination attempt. CNN headline read, Secret Service rushes Trump on stage as he falls at rally. I mean, how disgusting and disappointing to see it. But on the other hand, at least on X, you were getting real-time feeds. Some of it was inaccurate, of course, and other posters would correct them, and they would unwind or undo what they had erroneously said. But at least there was this free speech space where the dialogue could go on and people could hear and understand in real time what was happening. That doesn't solve our institutional rot, but finally getting some light into this dark hole is important.
Yeah, well, I would not counter your comment, but I do think it does address the institutional rot, because the independent media has become extremely good. I mean, most of my source information now is independent media. And you could say, is there a bias there? Well, absolutely there's a bias. Their bias is clear. So now I have one other layer of analysis that I don't have to do because I know their bias that they're presenting from. When we operated in Nigeria, our best source of information there was Twitter, of all things, and we would know sooner about a Boko Haram attack. And from both sides, the Boko Haram guys were putting stuff up on Twitter, and we would see their reports as well as our own. And the government was so late to the game, and the professional media, right, they couldn't compete with it because it was real time, people on the street giving their perspective, and you would go, okay, that attack happened, and we can start going through our analysis part. This whole move towards independent media, which I think is even being strengthened by events like the assassination attempt on this Saturday. The mainstream media just looks inept. They look slow. They don't have reporters on the ground for the most part. They are trusting local affiliates or something. They don't have their own means of gathering, which is a distinct institutional rot on their part, that they basically outsourced it, and it's all about celebrity and media like hype to drive what they are. And these people are paid lots of money, but how often do they get down in the weeds and do the real reporting and gather stuff? They're as dependent, I think, on local media or independent media as anybody, and they have their surrogates. So anyway, I do see that as a very positive effect, because that independent media immediately counters the garbage narratives we see in the mainstream.
That's for sure. Well, Scott, why don't we end it there? I want to thank you again for taking time to go over this day. We'll be watching in the days coming as to how this is going to play out. Scott Massey, always a pleasure. We'll see you next time.
Sure. All right. Take care. Thank you.